Good evening. I think we should start. Well, welcome everybody, and welcome also to the large numbers who are joining us online. If I could ask those of you online if you could mute yourself and close down your cameras, that will improve the bandwidth for the rest of you. And also, those of you online, please do enter any questions you have during the talk using the chat function, and we'll incorporate those into the questions at the end of the lecture. But before I introduce this evening's speaker, could I first ask the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting?
Thank you. So the first meeting of the 133rd season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 18th of November, 2025. Dr. Nicholas Bell, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Dr. Bell introduced Dr. David Shaw before presenting him with the Society's gold medal. Dr. Shaw replied with a short speech. The President then introduced three speakers on the Society's fifth grant recipients panel. Elvira Michelli delivered a paper entitled Reapproaching the Liber ad Honorum Augusti from the Carver Archive. Christian Algar gave a paper entitled The Reassembly, Analysis and Appraisal of John Bellingham Inglis, 1780 to 1870, rare book collector, savant, scholar, slave owner. And Jinyi Wen gave a paper entitled Extra Illustrating Early Modern Natural History. Dr. Bell thanked all speakers warmly for their papers and encouraged discussion during the drinks which followed.
Thank you, Liam. Is it your wish that I sign this as an accurate record? Thank you. Thank you. Well, now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Joseph Hone as our speaker at the second meeting of this year. Joseph Hone has published 4 books already in his career. He's been teaching at Newcastle in the English department since 2019. Before that, he was the Lumley Fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and Magdalen College, Cambridge, sorry, having completed his DPhil at the other place. And in fact, he's just spent the last term as a visiting fellow at All Souls. His most recent book was on certainly my most notorious predecessor as president, also most nefarious and ignoble, Thomas James Wise. I hope that many of you in this room have read that book. It's a really extraordinary book. There's a lot of new material, even for those who've read the many books on the subject that have been published over the last 70 years or so. But it doesn't include information about all of T.J. Wise's ignoble acts, and probably the worst. It's difficult to define which are the worst things he did, but I think that cutting pages out of the books in the British Museum Library was a worse thing to do than forging books that he'd spent a long time earlier in his life doing. And the pages that were cut out are the subject of this evening's talk. So I think I should hand the stage now to Joseph Hone to tell us more about Thomas James Wise's book Hospital, a further study in theft and sophistication. Thank you, Joseph.
And thank you all for coming. It is traditional at this time of year to gather around the hearth and to tell ghost stories. In the field of bibliography, there's perhaps no more unquiet soul than that of Thomas James Wise. Despite numerous stakes through the heart, he just won't stay dead. In the last few years of his life, thanks to the assiduity of John Carter and Graham Pollard, he was branded with the ignominious name of forger. On the 18th of October 1956, his reputation got even worse. In a prominent 2-column article for The Times, David Foxon declared Wise both forger and thief. Through painstaking bibliographical analysis, while cataloguing the early printed plays in Wise's Ashley Library, which the British Museum had purchased en bloc shortly before the breakout of war, Foxon concluded that more than 200 leaves had been torn from existing books at the museum to make up perfect copies for Wise and at least one other collector, John Henry Wren, a financier from Chicago. Wren's books had gone to the University of Texas at Austin in 1918. Subsequent research, undertaken with the help of William B. Todd, fully published in 1961, turned up more of the stolen leaves, in playbooks once owned by George Atherton Aitken, a British civil servant with whom Wise dealt, whose collection had also ended up in Texas. Let's go back to the man. Wise never publicly acknowledged that he collected and sold made-up books. None of the books are described as such in the monumental 11-volume catalogue of his Ashley Library, nor in the 5-volume catalogue of the Wren Library, which Wise edited. He was, however, open about his practice of perfecting books with friends, but not unsurprisingly, about stealing the raw materials. In late 1904, in a characteristically triumphant letter, so I thought that was the sound of the police for a minute, Wise revealed that he had made up Wren's copy of Dryden's Marriage à la Mode. Mrs. Wise, I found a very imperfect copy in a bundle of imperfect plays which I have. Unfortunately, it had the 2 leaves which in your copy had been supplied from a copy of the 3rd edition. So now the book is all right. Once again, the wisdom is proved of preserving any play, no matter how imperfect it may be. One never knows what may come in useful one time or other. As Wise's candor with Wren may suggest, such making up or sophistication of imperfect books with leaves supplied from defective copies was not only common among collectors and antiquarian dealers, but could even be considered best practice. Usually this was a case of supplying 1 or 2 leaves with no more interference than was necessary, purely to complete the book. Wise, however, did not want copies that were merely complete. He wanted, at least when it came to his own library, the very best copies that could conceivably exist. And when he could not acquire a sufficiently fine specimen on the market, he was willing to manufacture it. He would acquire leaves in whatever condition he could find, select the best exemplar of each leaf, and send the group for restoration and binding. As an old man, Frank Maggs recalled Wise's arrangements with the trade. Among many perfect books he obtained, many slightly defective ones, says Maggs, on occasion to be obtained for a fraction of the cost of perfect copies. He used to make inquiries round the booksellers for other defective copies, from which he could purchase some of the leaves he was wanting to complete his. Maggs remembered how, as a boy, he'd been, quote, sent to hunt through our imperfect books to see if we could give him any help. And on occasion, we were able to do so. As a result of his search, many of us, that is the young dealers, were on the lookout for the oddments he was wanting. One of his troubles was that these replacement leaves were often of a different size, or possibly had wormholes or stains. However, such a leaf was better than none. And in cases where no leaf could be found, we shall see that Wise resorted to theft. Foxon and Todd's analysis of the Ashley, Wren, and Aitken libraries revealed that Wise often built 2 or 3 playbooks, one for himself, one for Wren, and maybe one for the market. He'd be shuffling leaves from as many as 4 distinct copies of the edition, and in one instance, apparently 5. At the end of all this shuffling, though, there were often several leaves left over, sometimes from one copy, often from several. These scraps remained with Wise's widow until she died in 1939. And in that year, the Wise family effects were sold at auction. Now, the remnants of the Ashley Hospital were purchased by Dudley Massey of Pickering and Chatter. silently absorbed into that firm's hospital stock. And in 1981, the remaining leaves were acquired along with Pickering's entire stock of imperfect books by Quaritch, who identified 82 of them as corresponding in some way with the thefts uncovered by Foxon. And indeed, soon thereafter, Arthur Freeman announced that these leaves would be returned to the British Library, where Freeman explained, they will be retained as a discrete group, not reinstated in their parent volumes. For in the end, more important even than the neatness of the originals is the evidence of malfeasance and its detection. 45 years on, these leaves are at long last being entered into the general catalogue as part of a broader project to finish cataloguing work on the Ashley Library about time. There are 101 leaves in total, extracted from 35 copies of 27 different plays. My aim this evening is to use these scraps as a springboard to revisit the affair, to reassess evidence that had previously come to light, and to consider what new evidence might reveal about the nature of the thefts. Of particular interest is the complicity of Wise's preferred binder and restorer, Riviere and Son, and the advanced techniques that enabled the firm to transform leaves that often looked very different from one another into seemingly homogeneous, elegantly bound volumes, and in the process to disguise evidence of foul play. Book hospitals have been described as the dirty secret of the 20th century antiquarian trade. The remnants of the Ashley Hospital allow us to peek behind these closed doors, to see exactly what was going on. Many of the leaves discarded by Wise were originally conjugate with leaves that would be inserted into Ashley and Wren copies. So setting them alongside the books that emerged gleaming from the Riviere bindery provides a contrast that better enables us to see exactly what work had gone on, what these source leaves originally looked like, and how the restorers treated them. Before these remnants came to light, we could only speculate why Wise replaced certain leaves, but now we can see precisely what was wrong with them. Looking at the discards alongside books that Wise made up for sale or kept for himself helps to clarify the criteria against which he judged a book, what features he valued in a copy, what features he deemed essential, and of course what features he disliked. 4 loose leaves in the collection were stolen from the Garrick quartos in the museum, but evidently proved surplus to requirement. Uneven stubs in the books indicate that, generally speaking, these leaves were torn rather than cut out. Although in 2 cases, the inner margins of the leaves were subsequently trimmed down using a blade. As you can see here, it sort of slots in, but it's been trimmed down. Wise sometimes took both conjugate leaves, even when he only required one of them, which may, I think, suggest a degree of carelessness. As Foxon points out, when a leaf is torn from a book, its conjugate often comes loose, whereas if that leaf is carefully sliced away, there usually remains enough paper around the stitching to hold the conjugate in place. Once they're loose, it would have made more sense for Wise to simply take both leaves rather than risk handing it back to the issue desk with a detached leaf inside, which might alert staff to what's going on. So the second leaf would be collateral damage, essentially. By this point, Wise would presumably have known precisely what leaves he required. He'd probably dismantled the copies available to him, shuffling and assembling piles of leaves based on his aesthetic criteria, and then identifying gaps that might be supplied from the museum quartos. And this process of selection and assembly is actually, by some margin, the most difficult and mysterious aspect of this. However, Wise does give us a hint, and it's a good hint, in one of his letters to Wren, regarding a cheap copy of Davenant's The Wits, 1636, that Wren had bought in America, and then shipped over to Wise for assessment and binding in London. Bad mistake. This is Wise to Wren. Last evening, I went through your book leaf by the side of my own copy and made a list of its defects. The list I had typed today, and I enclose it herewith. The book has been badly cut at the bottom, hence the absence of several of the signatures and catchwords. Briefly, it was quite worth buying at $5.50. It's properly worth cleaning, and mending and binding, and it shall be serving as a stopgap copy. But it will only be a stopgap copy after all. It shall go to Mr. Culkin forthwith. Here Wise is describing sitting down for the evening, working methodically through the Wren and Ashley copies leaf by leaf, comparing respective defects. The tone is measured. This is a good book, but it's not a very good book. But there's more to this episode than Wise lets on. For the physical evidence contained within the books shows that he used this opportunity to disassemble the Ashley copy and to swap multiple leaves with the Wren copy, taking the best for himself. All this mixing and matching is going on in I and K. Presumably, this process of studying the copies side by side entailed rearranging the leaves into two new piles. When Wise realized that neither copy had an adequate K23, he stole the required leaves from the museum to make up his own perfect copy, while relegating the inadequate Ashley I4 and K14 into the Wren copy. From here, the two piles of leaves could be taken away for restoration and binding. Now, the Mr. Culkin mentioned by Wise was Arthur Culkin, chief binder at Riviere and seemingly a close personal friend. When Wise published his Landor bibliography in 1928, he presented the binder with a copy inscribed for Arthur Culkin from his best friend, Thomas James Wise. He was clearly Wise's go-to person at Riviere, and in my view, there's now sufficient evidence, both testimonial and forensic, to convict him as an accessory after the fact. In the first instance, in a letter written to John Carter, soon after the revelations about Wise's thefts went public, Foxon explained that during his investigations, he'd interviewed H.J. Phillips, then superintendent of bindings at the museum, who had undertaken his apprenticeship with Riviere. Now, Foxon's account of the conversation runs as follows. Phillips, our superintendent of bindings, was with Riviere's in the 20s and rather idolized Wise. He was, however, curious about where Wise got all these loose leaves. So he asked Culkin, who said, quote, "He steals them, of course." After a few days of anxious consideration whether this could be a joke, he then asked Strong, the paper restorer, who confirmed this. However, being very unwilling to blacken anyone's name, Phillips would not allow Foxon to quote him at the time, which forced Foxon to be vaguer than would otherwise have been the case. Now, the forensic evidence against Culkin, and it must be supposed Mr. Strong too, along with the other artisans at Riviere, yes, the forensic evidence concerns the removal of museum stamps. There are two particularly egregious examples. Wren's copy of Marlowe's Jew of Malta was heavily made up by Wise using leaves from 3 different copies, including 5 leaves stolen from the Garrick copy. On the final leaf, Riviere have diligently repaired a small hole next to the word finis that corresponds precisely in size and shape to the circular stamp used by the museum. So evidently the restorer is carefully razoring out this stamp before patching the hole and supplying the missing text on the recto in pen facsimile. The second example is the Ashley copy of Part 1 of Pope's Essay on Man. Now, this is a book that Wise spent a good deal of time and energy trying to locate on the market. In 1901, he informed Wren that despite owning large uncut copies of Parts 2 and 3, he'd not been able to find appropriate copies of Parts 1 and 4, and he refused to settle for anything that had been trimmed down. At some point, he eventually tired of waiting. For accepting the first leaf, the entirety of the Ashley copy was stolen from the museum, leaving behind only A1, which was heavily stamped on the verso. Now, the stolen leaves were matched, as you can see, to a much smaller A1, bound in tan Morocco by Riviere, though not before offset from the museum stamp had been removed from the recto of A2, seemingly by a combination of bleaching and scraping, which has left the paper thin and actually removed quite a bit of the watermark. This was involved technical work. It's difficult to imagine that Culkin or anyone handling these leaves could have remained ignorant of their origin. I mean, actually, here it is matched up with the remaining British Museum leaf. You can see the stamp lines up precisely with the erasure. Now, the binding technique that made all this shuffling and addition of leaves possible is, depending on the specifics, known as whip stitching or oversewing. Traditional European binding methods require thread to pass through the folds between leaves and then wrap around supports, which run along the spine at multiple points to it. These supports, along with kettle stitching, hold a book's folded gatherings together. Whip-stitched and oversewn bindings, though, do not require folds. Instead, the thread is looped around the spine at several points along it. The thread stabbed through the inner margin, essentially, in one or more small stacks of leaves, looped around, and some of these loops might also secure support cords or tapes along the spine. This method had only been standard since the early 19th century at the very earliest, and had become, by the end of the 19th century, more or less standard for rebinding early printed books. It makes it much easier to work with individual leaves, because with traditional sewing, leaves need to be joined in pairs and then grouped into folded gatherings. That's why cancels are pasted onto a stub, right, rather than stitched in. However, whip stitching allows you to bind a stack of individual leaves, not in folded gatherings. Damage to the inner margins, it often prompt the team at Riviere to build those margins back up, but this is much more straightforward than having to manufacture a fold where it didn't already exist. Now, whether or not Wise knew exactly how Riviere was binding these books for him is unclear, but his correspondence with Wren shows him consistently thinking about books in terms of individual leaves rather than gatherings. Wise's entire practice of building copies took for granted a binding technique that has only been widespread for a generation or two. So it's this technological development that enables the thefts to happen. The Wise understood the irrevocable damage caused by all this rebinding and substitution of leaves, may be demonstrated by a stunning statement from him in 1928 that, although focused on Byron first editions, has a much broader applications. This is T.J. Wise. In recent years, so much substitution has been effected that examples of books in modern binding are useless for the purposes of bibliography unless they come from a responsible source. In fact, they are frequently worse than useless, for, like inserted advertisement sheets, they sometimes serve to mislead. You think? It's stunningly audacious. One difficulty with making up all these copies, as Maggs noted in his reminiscence of Wise, is that replacement leaves were often of a different size, or had wormholes or stains. Now, books sophisticated before the middle of the 19th century are often obvious, because these differences in size and condition were difficult to eliminate using available treatments, if any attempt was made at all. We see here two examples separated by about 70 years. Can anyone even see the tear on the right? Right through the imprint. As demonstrated by the excised and patched British Museum stamp in the Marlow, however, paper restoration techniques have come a very long way. And the paper of the original Dew of Malta leaf and the patch have been grafted together so expertly that the transition between the two is almost seamless. The work can be difficult to detect without transmitted light, essentially. And restorers using blank end leaves or other sources of old paper were often able to match chain and sometimes even wire lines. Holes, missing corners, these can be filled. Leaves that previous binders had trimmed down too far could have their margins rebuilt. Leaves from any number of original copies could be built out to a nice uniform size. Any variation between the papers in color or condition might be evened out by washing, which was done in a solution of chlorinated lime, and then toning, which gently reintroduces a uniform shade of cafe au lait to these bleached out leaves. If anyone wants to know the recipe, it's a cocktail of licorice, coffee, chicory, and tea combined with gelatin for a setting agent. These two leaves from totally different copies, but they've been bleached and toned to have that same even color. And it's a color that you'll often see in books that have been rebound in the early 20th century. In the Riviere workshop, every effort was made to preserve as much printed text as possible. Wise had a very strong, one might even say deranged preference for books that were textually complete, so that if the margins of a book needed to be rebuilt, the restorers at Riviere carefully work around headers, signatures, catchwords before grafting on new paper. In cases where print had already been lost, though, whether to rot or an overseller's binder, it could be reintroduced by pen facsimile. Now, many of the books that Wise earmarked for Wren were treated in this way. For instance, in May 1905, he made up the imperfect Rowfant copy of Chapman's The Conspiracy and Tragedy of Childs, Duke of Byron, with a badly worm-eaten twopence halfpenny copy from Quaritch, assuring Wren that Riviere would, quote, vastly improve it in appearance. This remedial work involved substantial rebuilding of the upper margins, with pen and ink restoration to the header. And a year later, Wise buys another imperfect Rowfant book, Nash's Have With You to Saffron Walden. And he uses this to make up Wren's copy, which was missing the entire A gathering. You can see the A on the left has been built out with pen facsimile to the headers. Nonetheless, Wise assures Wren, quote, Mr. Culkin says that he will be able to make a very good job of this book. Whether or not that's a very good job is up to you. Now, comparing a discarded leaf against a companion leaf that was restored by Riviere enables us to see just how thoroughgoing some of this treatment must have been. The Ashley copy of the 1625 edition of Chapman's Conspiracy and Tragedy of Byron, well, that's been made up with 3 leaves stolen from the Garrett copy, H4, I1, and I2. Among the discarded Ashley leaves are the original Ashley H1 and I2. So we can see that the edges of this leaf on the right have been much primitively repaired. I'm not sure if that's the right word. Doubtless causing far more damage than was already the case. On the left is the facing H3. These are 2 leaves from the same original copy. One's been treated by Riviere, the other has not. And again, I mean, the repair work, when you encounter it in the book, it's virtually invisible without transmitted light. The leaves have been toned, thoroughly pressed, resulting in that crisp, uniform finish. Now, let's move on to some more recent books. I'll leave that there as a placeholder. Although, as Foxon noted, the early play quartos are the only class of book where the thefts are widespread, they were not the only books that Wise made up with alien leaves. In the catalogue of the Wise estate sale, the remnants of the Ashley workshop are described as, quote, a parcel of 17th and 18th century plays, including pamphlets by Dryden and others. So this suggests that Wise is making up later books too. Presumably the results would have been intended for sale, given that his own collection in this area was more or less complete. And his correspondence with Wren is open about this. We've already noted him talking about making up a copy of Dryden's Marriage a la Mode, which is entirely unnecessary given how commonly you encounter the play. However, his dealings in the 18th century material could be just as dishonest as with the pre-Restoration drama. This is something that Foxon uncharacteristically doesn't notice. There is, for instance, in the Wren collection, a copy of the first edition of The Beggar's Opera that's been made up with leaves taken from 2 later editions. And Wise, again, you have to marvel at the audacity of the man. He actually brazenly claims to Wren, "This copy differs in a most decided degree from any other copy I can find collated. I consider it to belong to an even earlier issue than my own." Oh, if that's true, he'd probably have kept it for himself, wouldn't he? The decision to steal leaves to make up perfect copies is even more shocking when one considers that Riviere could very easily provide high-quality lithographic facsimile, printed on old paper that passes, in my view, all but the very closest scrutiny. If a leaf could not be supplied from a hospital copy, Wise would supply it. If a leaf could not be found on the market but was available in the museum, he would steal it. If and only if there was no museum copy, then he would accept a facsimile leaf. Here's a book I was looking at about 3 hours ago. Fletcher's The Woman Hater, 1607. Which side is the facsimile? Anyone want to take a stab? It's very well done. On old paper, uniformly toned to the same shade as the rest of the book. But Wise only makes this concession because there is no Garrick copy of this play from which he can steal the gathering he needs. It's the sheet K on the right, by the way. In the case of hard-to-find Romantic era books, though, well then Wise is actually only too happy to skip the difficult business of securing authentic leaves and instead move straight into facsimile. And I suspect his comfort for doing so with 19th century books, but not with 18th and 17th century books, reflects his years of managing the production of type facsimile reprints for the Shelley and Browning societies. Faked up specimens of these reprints pass through the trade with some regularity. There are people in this audience who can tell you they still sometimes pass through the trade with some regularity. And presumably some of these originate with Wise himself. As early as 1894, the English collector John Herbert Slater reports that copies of Wise's 1886 reprint of Browning's Pauline had been, quote, cleverly doctored to look like the original edition. The title and prefatory note had been removed, explains Slater, and the pages newly bound in the kind of very expensive cover, suitable to a very desirable book. So far as can be told, Wise never attempted to impose any of these faked-up reprints on Wren. Presumably, Wren's already got copies of them in his libraries, which would have facilitated an easy comparison, would have been foolhardy. However, Wise did make up defective Shelley and Byron first editions with facsimile leaves, selling them to Wren as perfect copies. Now, there are at least 3 instances of this of which I'm aware. 2 Shelleys and a Byron. Since 1899, Wren had been pressuring Wise to find him a copy of Shelley's Queen Mab. After Wise rather stupidly advised Wren not to buy a decent copy from Zaehnsdorff for only £30. Would have been a good investment, that. For years, Wise strung Wren along, informing him of various copies that just might be coming to market, and assuring him that he's surely going to snag one soon. By 1907, Wise has evidently grown tired of waiting, for in March, he writes to Wren and says, look, I've finally secured a copy for you at auction, but it's cost £53. But it's a great copy, exceedingly fine copy, in fact, described by Wise as very large, the edges being only just trimmed, while, quote, every leaf from first to last is as clean and fresh as new. Well, in fact, the copy that Wise has purchased lacked its title leaf, dedication leaf, and final leaf. Famously, Shelley had actually mutilated this book before publication, removing those leaves. In this instance, the reason those leaves looked fresh as new is that they were new. Wise had supplied them in type facsimile before sending the book to Riviere for binding. The two remaining examples are no less egregious. The sound uncut copy of Shelley's Epipsychidion that Wise acquires for Wren in 1901, well, that's a made-up copy with a half-title taken from the facsimile reprint that Wise had produced for the Shelley Society in 1887. And the copy of Byron's The Bride of Abydos, which Wise trumpeted as a major acquisition for the Wren Library, was actually a confection, made up with sheets taken from the third edition and a facsimile title page printed from the same plate used to illustrate the Ashley Library catalogue, which, as Fanny Ratchford noticed, actually betrays itself by an absent colon. So poor old Wren really ought to have looked harder. Like the early modern drama, all these books were restored and bound in the usual exquisite manner by Riviere. No doubt Colkin and his men were perfectly aware of what was going on. There are two reasons for dwelling on Wise's making up of modern firsts using facsimile leaves, as well as his mixing and matching of early playbooks. One of these is that it shows this disease is not contained. The making up of books was not an exception in Wise's wheeling and dealing, it was the rule. The second reason is that previous work on Wise has tended to compartmentalize the two aspects of the criminal career. The Venn diagram of forgery and theft barely overlap, except here, in these facsimilized Shelleys and Byrons, we see that it does overlap. The person who stole leaves to make up perfect playbooks was very much the same person who abused his role in the Shelley Society to produce faked-up facsimiles. In both cases, it is very much the same mind at work. Okay. The loose remnants of the Ashley Hospital foreground questions of taste, condition, and the criteria against which Wise judged a book. Coverage of the Ashley collection always emphasized Wise's unrelenting pursuit of bibliographical perfection, in tones that seems ironic now. Seymour de Ritchie describes it as the finest library in the world of more recent English literature. David Nicholl Smith applauded Wise for, quote, making it a rule never to procure a book that was not perfect. A doctrine that he has, quote, consistently preached to young and modest collectors who are more tolerant of the maimed and defective. It is safe to say that no one who has seen the Ashley Library has ever seen another in which the condition of the books is so uniformly flawless. Well, yes, it's difficult now not to hear those words as tinged with irony, yet more than any of his contemporaries, I think Wise understood that condition could be manufactured. The margins of a cropped copy might be rebuilt to create the illusion of height. Dirty leaves and those marred by annotations might be bleached clean. Wormholes might be patched. Library stamps made to disappear. As Wise explained to Wren early on regarding a copy of Adonais that he had just secured for him, it was presently, quote, a sound and not too much cut copy, but, quote, if sized and bound by Riviere, it would make an excellent copy. So restoring, resizing, rebinding, these are all for Wise the essential qualities of a good book. At the same time, though, Wise is much less willing to reconstruct the textual features of a book. As a collector, he prioritized textual completeness over physical integrity. Each non-blank leaf demanded by the collation must be present, though not necessarily from the same copy. And each of those individual leaves should be textually intact from the header at the top of the page to the catchword in the bottom corner. Conversely, the discarded leaves demonstrate precisely what bibliographical faults Wise simply could not tolerate. Annotation, including early inscriptions, ink spills, printing flaws, worming, tearing resulting in lost text, cropping with loss to headers, any of these defects might be enough to relegate a book to the status of hospital copy. Books that required pen and ink repairs would generally be viewed as stopgap copies, to be kept only until a better copy comes along, and then they could be sold to one of Rise's clients. Now, working with Aaron Pratt at the Harry Ransom Centre, I've been able to determine the origin of 58 of the 101 leaves. We've relied on the methods pioneered by Foxon in his original investigation. Paper floor impressions, alignment of chain lines, watermarks, contiguous damage, patterns of staining across leaves, patterns of repair work, colouring or gilding of edges, wormholes. It goes on. But most usefully of all, the holes resulting from stab stitching. But there remain considerable puzzles, and not just with those last 43 leaves that we cannot work out for love nor money. Despite a protracted search, especially concerning for us, I think are the numerous leaves that correspond to leaves that we know to have been stolen or supplied, but were in fact extracted from copies that cannot now be traced. So for instance, if an H4 has been stolen from a Garrick copy, and we have an H4 from the same play, but it's not the Garrick H4, what's happened? The horrifying truth, I think, is that in some cases, Wise appears to have been shuffling leaves not from 2 or 3 copies, as we previously thought, but from 5 or 6. The most perplexing case, and this has haunted me for months, Thomas Nabbs's The Unfortunate Mother. Wise stole 15 leaves in total from 2 different museum copies. The copy that he made up for Wren comprises leaves from at least 3 different copies, none of which corresponds to the museum copies. And the loose leaves, too, come from another 3 different copies, none of which matches either the museum copies or the copies cannibalized to make up Wren. So that's 8 butchered copies that we know about. As you can see, so these are not from the same copy because I'm circling the stitching holes there. They weren't stab stitched together. The combination of so many remaining and untraceable leaves would appear to suggest that Wise was operating on a greater scale than we'd hitherto appreciated. And while the best leaves would eventually have made their way into Ashley and Wren books, the lesser specimens, they went elsewhere, sometimes to be swapped or sold, sometimes to go back into the trade via mags, or one of the auctioneers, thereafter to bounce around the market. The leaves that remained with the Ashley books upon Wise's death, I think these are probably leaves that he believes might either A, one day have some trading value, or B, might yet be used to make up new copies. But they are by no means the totality of the hospital. Scared? Part of the appeal of the Christmas Ghost story lies in contrast, okay? You know, the thrilling shiver that only enhances the warmth and the hearth and the comfort of home. We accept them because they're happening to someone else, somewhere else, sometime else. Yet this has been no such distant tale. No, on this occasion, I fear the scrape and jangle of chains is coming from within the house. There is a shiver in the air. A ghostly army of sophisticated and made-up books, no doubt some of them made whole by Wise, haunt the stacks of major libraries and lurk on the shelves of collectors and booksellers. Facsimilized Shelleys, Frankensteined Marlowes, unidentified stolen leaves. Their surfaces may be washed clean, but some blemishes run deep, and I suspect that someone somewhere in this room may have one of these profane artifacts on your home or on your desk without even knowing it. And if so, my closing words are addressed to you and you alone. Sleep tight. Thank you very much.